There is a genetic signature that refuses to behave. It splits. One half points south, toward the great river plains of the Indian subcontinent, toward the Sanskrit-speaking kingdoms, toward the priestly lineages of the Gangetic corridor. The other half points northeast, toward the high-altitude steppes of Tibet, toward the cold-adapted populations of the Himalayan plateau, toward the kind of ancestry you would expect to find in a people who have lived above the clouds for 25,000 years. And it belongs to the same person, sits in the same genome. In a people who speak a Tibeto-Burman language, who have maintained their own religion, their own script, their own architecture, for more than 2,000 years, in a mountain kingdom perched precisely on the seam between two of the world's great civilizations. The Y chromosome says one thing, the mitochondrial DNA says another, and the language says something neither of them predicted. For generations, we have had a story to explain this. It was tidy, it was logical, it was almost certainly incomplete. The standard account of how Nepal came to be, demographically, genetically, culturally, is the kind of story that satisfies a textbook. Two great streams, flowing in from opposite directions, settling in layers. The first stream came from the north and east. Thousands of years ago, populations of Tibeto-Burman origin descended from East Asia across the high passes of the Himalayas, establishing themselves in the middle hills and mountain valleys of what would become Nepal. The Tamang came this way, the Gurung, the Rai, the Limbu, the Sherpa, the world's most famous high-altitude people, followed the same general route. Their languages belong to the Tibeto-Burman family, related, distantly but measurably, to languages spoken in Tibet, in northern Myanmar, in the highland reaches of northeastern India. The second stream came from the south and west. Indo-Aryan speaking peoples, carrying Sanskrit, the Vedic tradition, the caste system in its early Brahminic form, moved northward from the Great Plains, up through the Terai lowlands and into the hills. The Bahun, the priestly caste. The Chetri, the warrior administrator class. They brought temple architecture. They brought Sanskrit inscriptions. They brought legal and social frameworks that would persist for a millennium. And then there were the Newars. The Newars of the Kathmandu Valley occupy a special position in this model. They are the autochthones, the original ones, the people already there when the Indo-Aryan stream arrived. The pre-existing civilization of the valley, speaking their own Tibeto-Burman tongue, maintaining their own Buddhist and Hindu ritual traditions in a synthesis found nowhere else on earth, building the pagodas and the temple courtyards and the merchant quarters of Kathmandu, Bhaktapur, and Patan across a documented urban history of more than 2,000 years. Two streams, one valley people already rooted in place. The result? Nepal. The story is linguistically coherent, geographically logical, taught in schools, mapped in atlases, confirmed by the kinds of cultural evidence that historians and ethnographers have trusted for generations. Here is where it gets complicated. When geneticists began sequencing these populations, not categorizing them by language, not assigning them by caste, but reading the actual molecular record written inside the chromosomes, the two-stream model did not break, but it developed a crack. And in that crack, something unexpected was waiting. A Y chromosome haplogroup is like a surname passed down not through records or legal documents, but through the body itself, a marker traveling from father to son across thousands of years without dilution, without revision. If you know which haplogroup a man carries, you know something about where his paternal lineage has been, not in the last generation, but in the last 100 generations. Haplogroup R1A1, marked by a mutation called M198, is the defining paternal signature of populations associated with the ancient Indo-Aryan migration. It is common in North Indian Brahmin castes. It peaks in parts of South Asia and Central Asia. In populations of clear Tibetan genetic heritage, it is essentially absent, appearing in Tibet at roughly 1.9% frequency. In the Tamang people of Nepal, Highland Tibeto-Burman by language, culture, and general genetic profile, it sits at a modest 4.4%. Consistent with minimal South Asian contact at the paternal level. Now consider the Newars, the supposed pre-Aryan indigenous substrate of the valley, the Tibeto-Burman speakers, the people who were there before the Sanskrit streams arrived. Among the Newars, R1A1-M198 appears at 25.7%. Not Indian, not Tibetan. In the broader Kathmandu population, it reaches 35.1%. A 2007 study by Gaydon and colleagues, published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, documented these frequencies across Nepalese and Tibetan populations, and the number that stopped researchers was the 13-fold difference across a single mountain range. On one side of the Himalayas, 1.9%. On the other side, among a people who linguistically and culturally claim Tibetan-adjacent identity, 25.7%. That is not a gradient. That is a wall with a door in it that someone has been using. And then the maternal line. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited only from the mother, a complementary record of where a population's women have been across the same span of generations, tells its own story in the Nuars. Roughly half of Nuar maternal lineages trace to South Asian haplogroups, a quarter trace to East and Southeast Asian origins. The proportions mirror neither their language classification nor their self-understanding as pre-Aryan indigenes. The paternal line says South. The maternal line says both simultaneously. The language says Northeast. And researchers at Tribhuvan University, examining the Y chromosomal architecture of Nuar subgroups, found the full complexity laid bare. R1A, O3A3, H1, J2A, all present in a single population, a genetic library that should not exist if the two-stream model were the complete picture. Not Indian, not Tibetan, not simply either. The first theory, the one mainstream anthropology reaches for, is the theory of elite male migration. Kathmandu Valley has been a major trade node since at least the 4th century CE, when the Licchavi dynasty established Sanskrit-based governance and opened the valley to sustained contact with the Indian plains. Priests came north to staff the growing temple complexes. Administrators followed the trade routes. Merchants with high-caste South Asian credentials settled in a city already wealthy from its position on the Southern Silk Road. These were men with social prestige and access, and over 1,500 to 2,000 years, their paternal markers accumulated in the Newar gene pool through intermarriage, through the slow social processes by which elite lineages get absorbed. The haplogroup O3A5-M134, the dominant East Asian and Tibeto-Burman paternal marker, is estimated by the same Gaydon study to have been present in Himalayan populations for approximately 8,100 years. That is, the older substrate. R1A1 layered on top of it over the last 2 millennia, not through conquest or mass replacement, but through the quiet arithmetic of prestige and proximity. This theory is coherent. It matches the archaeological record. It explains why certain Nuar subgroups, the Shakya, the Bajracharya, priestly lineages with known historical connections to Indian Buddhist institutions, show the strongest South Asian genetic signals. But it runs into a problem. The elevated R1A1 signature is not confined to Nuar elites. Non-priestly, non-elite Nuar communities carry it too, at rates that are harder to attribute to a narrow stream of high-status male migration. And the theory says almost nothing about the maternal line. If this were simply an elite Indian men marrying into local Nuar families story, the maternal DNA should remain largely Tibeto-Burman in character. It doesn't. The South Asian maternal pull is present and substantial. Elite male influx alone does not explain both lines moving in the same direction. The second theory is more complicated and more uncomfortable for anyone who has inherited the standard textbook picture. What if the Nuars are not the pre-existing indigenous population who received the Indo-Aryan stream from outside? What if the Nuars themselves were formed by a much earlier admixture, 3,000 years ago, perhaps even older, between a Tibeto-Burman speaking population already in the valley and a large influx of South Asian people who brought not just culture, but their chromosomes? A 2022 study published in Human Genetics by Basnet and colleagues analyzed the mitochondrial DNA sequences of 999 Nepalese individuals and compared them against more than 38,000 published mtDNA sequences from across the world. What they found was striking. The genetic profile of prehistoric Himalayan settlers of Nepal most closely resembled the low-altitude Newar and Magyar groups, not the high-altitude Sherpas, who are so often treated as the representative Himalayan type. The Newars, in this reading, are not a remnant of an old Tibetan-adjacent substrate. They are the original Himalayan admixture, the founding blend. The overall Nepalese gene pool, across all ethnic groups, breaks down to approximately 51.63% South Asian ancestry and 36.59% East Eurasian ancestry in broad genomic analyses. But those averages mask what appears to have been a highly uneven, multi-stage process, some groups receiving more South Asian signal earlier, some receiving it later, some protected by geography or cultural endogamy from receiving much of it at all. In this model, the Newars' linguistic identity, their Tibeto-Burman tongue, survived not because they were ethnically Tibeto-Burman who happened to receive some South Asian contact. It survived because language can persist through a demographic transition that genetics cannot hide. The men arrived, the language held. Both left their mark. Here is where the records stop cooperating. If this second theory is correct, if the Newars represent an ancient large-scale admixture rather than a preserved indigenous substrate, then something remarkable happened. A population absorbed the chromosomes of a major South Asian influx and yet retained a linguistic and cultural identity so distinct that scholars classified them as Tibeto-Burman aboriginals for 200 years of modern scholarship. Whatever protected that cultural core was powerful. What it was, the genetics cannot say. The third theory is the one most researchers are careful not to state directly. They frame it as a footnote about altitude adaptation. But the data hasn't ruled out that the footnote belongs in the main text. In 2016, a team led by Hackinger and colleagues, publishing in Human Genetics, examined a specific 32.7 kilobase stretch of the human genome, a region within a gene called EPAS1, which regulates the body's response to low oxygen environments. In Tibetans and Sherpas, this region carries a haplotype of archaic origin, not just old. Archaic, meaning it entered the human gene pool through interbreeding with Denisovans, a separate hominin lineage that shared the planet with our ancestors and then disappeared. The Denisovan EPAS1 haplotype gave Tibetans and Sherpas a biological edge at altitude. Their hemoglobin behaves differently at 5,000 meters than it does in any lowland population, and the molecular reason is a piece of DNA from a species that is no longer alive. Here is what Hackinger's team found when they looked beyond the high-altitude populations. The Denisovan EPAS1 haplotype is present in Nepalese and Bhutanese populations living at all altitudes, including lowlanders at 86 meters above sea level. In 1,507 Eurasian individuals tested, including 1,188 from Nepal and Bhutan, the archaic signal appeared consistently across altitude groups, with a statistically significant correlation to elevation, Spearman's coefficient 0.75, p-value 3.9 times 10 to the negative 11, but not absent at low altitude, not absent in the valley. Researchers are careful to frame this as a finding about adaptive biology, not ancestry classification. And that caution is appropriate. But consider what it means if the Newars represent the original admixture point between highland and lowland Himalayan populations. Consider that their genome may carry traces of a third ancestral population, one that is neither South Asian nor East Asian, one that predates both migration streams, one that does not appear in any modern reference panel used by consumer ancestry tests because no modern population is its direct descendant. The data doesn't confirm this reading, it only fails to rule it out. Imagine you are standing in the courtyard of Pashupatinath Temple on the banks of the Bagmati River in Kathmandu in the first light of an early June morning. It is 5:30 in the morning. The temperature is 22 degrees Celsius and the air carries three things simultaneously: the sweetness of marigold garlands placed on the shrines before dawn, the thick drift of incense smoke from the burning ghats on the river's edge, and underneath both of them, the cold mineral smell of river stone and pre-monsoon moisture rising from the Bagmati's banks. The peaks of the Himalayan rim are visible from the valley's edge on clear mornings, And this is a clear morning, white and distant and impossible seeming, the way mountains always look when you are standing in a city at their feet. The man performing the morning ritual in front of you is Nuar. The mantras on his lips are in Sanskrit, a liturgical language that traveled north from the Gangetic Plain with the Brahminic tradition. The weaving pattern of the cloth at his waist carries a motif that echoes textile traditions from Tibet. The temple he is standing in was built by craftsmen who developed an architectural form, the tiered pagoda, that influenced temple design across Nepal and into Tibet itself. He has been here, in this city, in this continuity, for his entire life. His ancestors have been here for 40 generations. This city was already old when Rome fell. He does not experience himself as a mystery. He is simply here. Now imagine a technician hands you a paper, a genetics report, his results. South Asian, 52%. East Eurasian, 36%. Unclassified Himalayan component, 12%. The technician explains that the 52 and the 36% are consistent with known reference populations. The 12% is not. It does not match any modern population in the database. It does not cluster with Tibetan samples. It does not cluster with South Asian samples. It does not cluster with anything currently living that the algorithm knows how to name. The technician pauses. And here the story stops being simple in the most unexpected way, because the reframe is not about the Nuars at all. It is about the Sherpas. The Sherpa are Nepal's most famous people internationally. They are the face of Himalayan identity to the outside world, the high-altitude guides, the mountaineers, the summit companions, the people whose genetic adaptation to thin air has been studied extensively precisely because it is so remarkable. When most people think of Nepal's indigenous population, when they reach for an image of what Himalayan human heritage looks like, they reach for the Sherpa. The Sherpas are the newcomers. Research by Bandari and colleagues, published in Scientific Reports in 2015, drawing on 582 Sherpa genetic samples from Nepal and the Tibetan Autonomous Region, concluded that the Sherpas are a recently derived population from the Tibetan Plateau. Their high-altitude adaptation, the EPAS1 variants, the hemoglobin regulation that allows them to function above 8,000 meters, was not developed in Nepal. It was inherited directly from their Tibetan ancestors, who had already evolved it during tens of thousands of years on the plateau, and who migrated into the Khumbu Valley of Nepal within the last several hundred years. Sherpa oral tradition places this migration around the 15th century CE. The genetics are consistent with that account. The Sherpas arrived. They brought their altitude genes with them. They did not evolve them in place. The Nuars have been documented in the Kathmandu Valley for more than 2,000 years. Their genome carries the evidence of every migration that has passed through that valley, South Asian, East Asian, and something older that neither category names. Their genetic record is, by every measure, the more complex one, the messier one, the harder to explain. But complexity is not contamination. A genome that refuses to resolve neatly is not a genome that failed to be pure. It is a genome that was present for everything, that kept records when no one else was writing. The Sherpa arrived pure and adapted. The Nuars were there first, absorbing everything, forgetting nothing. That genome, messy, layered, contested, may be the oldest thing in the Himalayas. Nepal's genetic story is not a special case. It is the clearest possible example of something that is true everywhere, but rarely this legible. The borders between civilizations have never matched the borders inside human DNA. Every mountain range, every river, every political line drawn on a map has been used at some point to say, these people belong here, and those people belong there. The genome has quietly, consistently, across every population ever sequenced, refused that instruction. It keeps its own records. It moves through barriers. It does not recognize the agreements made above it. What makes the Himalayan case visible, what makes Nepal useful for this argument, is the extremity of the geography. These are the tallest mountains on Earth. If two populations can mix this thoroughly, exchange this much DNA, across a barrier this formidable, across 2,000 years of documented cultural separation, then the idea of ancestry as a fixed address, as a permanent property of a place, is not merely scientifically imprecise, it is geographically impossible. What the Nepalese genome shows is not a population caught between two identities. It shows a population that formed before the identities were separate, that carries the memory of a time when South and East did not yet have a border because the border had not yet been agreed upon. The people who are not Indian and not Tibetan are not a puzzle to be solved. They are an archive to be read, an archive that has been accumulating entries for 3,000 years, written in a script that no political map has ever used, kept by a people who never needed a geneticist to tell them who they were. Not Indian, not Tibetan, older than both the names and still writing.